Sometimes in World of Warcraft, they'll introduce new abilities or talents to the game, which are too difficult to balance, so they just completely alter them to something else, or remove them completely from the game. And in this list, we'll go over which one of these abilities were removed the fastest in this way. And at number 10, we have Void Tendrils, which existed in the game for 2 expansions before being removed. And this will be absolutely the longest out of all of the abilities on this list, since the ability was still in the game for 2 expansions even after it was heavily altered and nerfed. You see, what Void Tendrils did was it was a very innocuous priest CC ability, which would root nearby targets to the priest for the standard PvP duration, or 20 seconds in non-PvP scenarios. And what was unique about these roots was that they did not break on damage, like pretty much every single other root in the game, because they had a little gimmick to them. You see, in order to break the roots of Void Tendrils, you had to literally attack and kill the Void Tendrils which were rooting you in place. And since the root was counted as a target you had to defeat, they couldn't be dispelled either, which gave them all kinds of advantages over normal CC abilities. This ability basically removed melee characters from the fight, and allowed you to attack them with impunity from range, which is kind of why other roots break on damage. They could also be considered a full form of protection, as the melee character would have to attack the Void Tendrils for a bit if they wanted to break them, which meant they had to stop their attack on anything else. The Void Tendrils were also pretty beefy, as they had 20% of the priest's health, so it was like attacking through a fifth of a player's health bar in order to get through them, which meant you couldn't easily one-shot them to get out quickly. And they of course had a short 30-second cooldown, and could affect up to 5 targets, and was one of the first talents a priest could pick up, and could be used alongside other CCs they had. And the funny thing is, Void Tendrils were not considered overpowered, because this all happened in Mists of Pandaria. And Mists of Pandaria is when PvP crowd control was at its most power-crept version in the game's history. It's kind of the point in WoW that they never wanted to get to again, with every class having a ridiculous amount of CC. And since it existed in this time period, it kind of flew under the radar a little bit. Only a little bit, because as soon as Warlords of Draenor hit, the ability received all kinds of nerfs. It was moved to a higher level in the talent tree, so you can no longer get it at low levels. They lowered the health of the Tendrils in half, and made it so any damage you dealt to the rooted target also dealt damage to the Tendrils, so you could no longer attack melee targets caught in it with impunity. And all of these nerfs made the ability kind of useless, which is why they later buffed the HP of the Void Tendrils by 30%, and then eventually just removed them in Legion rather than try to deal with this problem of an ability. So really, it only existed in its prime for 1 expansion, and only lasted as long as it did because everything else was kind of broken in the same time period. And at number 9, we have Glyph of Unleashed Lightning. This was a glyph that only existed for 1.25 expansions before it was just removed and converted into something that was kind of useless. You see, what this glyph did, which was added to the game in late Cataclysm, was simply allow shamans to cast the lightning bolt spell while moving. And that's it. It just allowed them to cast their filler spell on the move at the cost of giving up one of their glyph slots. You see, in the time period, a lot of casters were getting a lot of mobility, and this is when they were starting to loosen the rules and abilities that let casters do stuff on the move. And this glyph was kind of an experiment of letting one of the casters use their filler spell all the time on the move just to see how it affected the game. I assume, because Warlocks could also get Kil'jaeden's Cunning very shortly after, which also allowed them to cast filler spells while on the move. Hunters were given the ability to cast everything on the move, and priests were given shadowy apparitions, which in their very first form had a super increased chance to spawn if they were on the move. And what do you know? Everybody loved the glyph. Every shaman took it. It was probably one of the most used glyphs ever. Well, that might be a little bit of hyperbole. Most classes only had a handful of good glyphs anyway, but you kind of get the point. It was so good that they had to nerf it a little bit. In Mists of Pandaria, it was changed to actually have a downside to the cast, where it would impose a 5% haste penalty if you cast Lightning Bolt while moving. This was supposed to make it so that you couldn't do full damage while on the move, and had to take some kind of hit for that maneuverability, but it wasn't really enough. Shamans kept moving while doing their full rotation, so only had to sit still for a handful of moments, but for the most part, this glyph made them one of the most mobile casters in the game. And since Warlocks had to take up one of their precious talent points in order to gain similar mobility, they decided to remove it from the game in patch 5.3. and instead replace it with Glyph of Lightning Shield. And shamans have been sad ever since, and always ask for the return of the glyph in some way. Warlocks also lost the ability to cast while moving. Blizzard changed their mind hardcore after Mists of Pandaria, and kinda took away all casters' abilities to do stuff while moving. Except hunters. They just kinda made one of the specs have to stand still for a bit instead. So since the glyph was added in the second patch in Cataclysm, and then removed in the third patch in Mist of Pandaria, it was only in the game for about 1 1/4 expansions, give or take. I'm not doing actual math on this since this is the only ability on this list which was added and removed mid-expansions. And at number 8, we have Clash, a Brewmaster Monk ability. This ability, added with the Monk class when they were introduced to the game, simply allowed the Monk to charge a target while also death gripping the target to their location, and then they would meet like halfway and then stun everything else around them at the point of impact. So it was half a charge, half a pull, and was an excellent tool for monks to give them even more maneuverability, as they were one of the most mobile classes in the game at the time. However, with the shift in Warlords of Draenor to remove a ton of class maneuverability and CC, Clash kind of hit the cutting room floor because it was both of those things. It could be considered a gap closer and a CC, because that's exactly what it was. So this ability only existed in the game for one expansion. Now, just like Void Tendrils, it wasn't really causing any problems, but that's because it was Mist of Pandaria and everyone was broken. Currently, Blizzard has plans on returning Clash to the game in Shadowlands, as monks have the ability on the beta, and it's only a slightly nerfed version of its Mist of Pandaria counterpart, as it still basically does the exact same thing. It no longer has an AoE stun component to it like it used to, instead it roots all targets that are nearby when you clash with your target. And at number 7, we have Symbiosis. This is a druid ability that only existed in Mist of Pandaria. You might be seeing a theme here with all of these removed abilities, and was only in the game for one expansion. And I don't think I've ever seen an ability balanced and fixed and tuned as much as Symbiosis, despite the fact that it was only around for a single expansion. Because what it did was probably more than any other ability in the game's history. Essentially, it allowed the druid to learn one of 40 new abilities, depending on which class they use the ability on. I'll have a whole list of them on screen, and it would also grant the ability to another class it was used on. It was an ability that required a flowchart to make best use of, and it was a nightmare to balance. They constantly made changes and adjustments to it throughout its entire history, before just giving up on it and removing it in the very next expansion. If anything, I'm sure they wanted to remove it even faster than that, but since it was one of the hallmark abilities that druids were supposed to obtain with that new expansion, they were probably obligated to stick it out until the end of the expansion. This one was definitely removed because of balancing nightmares, and not because it was overpowered. I'm sure most groups thought it was just a fun, neat little thing druids could do, that most people never really bothered with. It didn't really impact World First races that much, and since everything else was broken in PvP in that expansion, it didn't really stand out on that front either. Now, I actually bring this ability up a lot in other videos that talk about removed abilities, because this ability was so unique that it just kinda gets brought up a lot in these kinds of things. And at number 6, we have Gladiator's Resolve. This was a town that only existed for one expansion in Warlords of Draenor, and basically gave Prot Warriors a new stance called Gladiator Stance, which increased the damage reduction of their defensive stance by 5% if they wanted some use of it outside of its new Gladiator Stance. But while in Gladiator Stance, which replaced a Battle Stance, it increased their damage by 5%, gave them a 50% increase to their mastery, and replaced their shield with a shield charge ability. And there was also a little caveat to the ability where you could not change into or out of the stance during combat. So if you picked Gladiator Stance, you were stuck in it. So why was this ability removed? Well, it essentially gave Protection Warriors 2 specs within a spec, in the same way that Feral Druids used to work before they were split into 2 separate specs, Guardian and Feral for their tank and DPS builds. For Protection Warriors, there was the normal defensive stance build, and then the Gladiator Stance build, which did more damage, but it wasn't supposed to be competitive with a pure damage build, even though with the right gear and theory crafting, it could do pretty well for itself. And a lot of people loved the Gladiator Stance, as it was essentially providing a 4-spec to warriors. But in Legion, they were removing stances from the game, and it was a nightmare to balance. So instead of trying to incorporate it into the game as a 4-spec like they did with druids, they just kind of got rid of it since it wasn't really that different anyway. And at number 5, we have Dematerialize, a monk passive ability which only existed in the game for one expansion in Mist of Pandaria. And what this ability did was when you were stunned, you would phase out of existence temporarily for 2 seconds, causing attacks to miss you on a 10-second cooldown. And what this essentially meant was a monk was all but immune to abilities for 2 seconds after they got stunned, which kind of made them softly immune to stuns, as in PvP situations you would generally dump all of your damage onto a target as soon as they got CC'd. And it would be very difficult to remember that you had to hold back on monks specifically for 2 seconds after a stun took place, so that all of your cooldowns wouldn't miss. It was such a good passive ability that it was changed pretty quickly within the expansion, and given all kinds of nerfs before they just removed it from the game completely as soon as they could in the next expansion. And it's probably one of the strongest passive abilities that has ever been added to the game, because of just how huge being immune to attacks for 2 seconds after being stunned is, since that's one of the main ways people crowd control someone before laying in heavy damage. And at number 4, we have Prismatic Crystal, a mage talent that only existed for one expansion in Warlords of Draenor. What this ability did was on a cooldown you could place a crystal on the floor next to a target, and then you could attack it for 12 seconds. Every time you attack the crystal, it would pulse the damage to everything around the crystal for exactly the amount of damage you put into it, and it would also increase the damage dealt to the crystal, so it could essentially turn all of your abilities into an AoE for 12 seconds. Now, funny thing about the crystal, it replicated all of the damage you dealt, including the damage from trinkets. So, towards the end of the expansion, mages were able to use this AoE trinket called the Prophecy of Fear, which would put debuffs on the target for 10 seconds that would pulse AoE damage every time you dealt damage to the target that had the debuff. So, if an arcane mage just pumped a whole bunch of arcane missiles that proc the hell out of that trinket, it would deal its AoE damage around the crystal, and then deal the damage again from the crystal itself, replicating the damage, which essentially allowed them to double up on the trinket's damage, and allowed groups of mages to kill bosses in under 30 seconds at the end of the expansion, when they kind of overgeared the stuff anyway. And the crystal wasn't a very well-liked talent. It was good and kind of overpowered if you optimized for it, but it was kind of clunky to use and required a target to be near it for 12 seconds to get the full benefit out of it. So not too many people were super sad to see it go away when it was removed in the very next expansion, so they no longer had to try to balance it. Honestly, they could kind of balance it pretty easily by just allowing only mage abilities to work on it, or only certain kinds of abilities to be transferred through, similar to how Atonement works for Disc Priests. And at number 3, we have Aspect of the Fox, version 2.0. which was added to the game in Warlords of Draenor in one of the earliest patches, before being removed 2 patches later in 6.2. Now, Amplify Magic also makes this spot on the list since it kind of fit in the same theme as Aspect of the Fox. You see, in Warlords of Draenor, they wanted to give a couple of the pure DPS classes utility inside of the raid in the form of raid-wide cooldowns. So, what they did for mages and hunters was give them 2 abilities that they no longer had, and retool them to work in a way similar to how they used to work when they were part of their classes. Aspect of the Fox was the aspect hunters used to have that would allow them to cast while moving, before they just let them cast while moving baseline and kind of remove the idea of aspect dancing from the game. And Amplify Magic was a very niche ability that mages could cast on people that would increase the amount of healing they received, but also increase the amount of magic damage they took. So what the new raid-wide ability hunters received did was, on a 3-minute cooldown, it would allow everyone in the raid to cast while moving for 6 seconds. And for mages, on a 2-minute cooldown, it would increase the healing everyone in the raid received by 10% for 6 seconds. And these are both good effects. So, why were they removed from the game? Well, for 2 reasons. For one, hunters and mages didn't like using them. They didn't play those classes in order to give the raid buffs. They wanted to just focus on dealing damage, and the abilities didn't increase their damage at all. They were helpful to the raid, sure, but they weren't exactly excited about being able to use them. And for 2, Aspect of the Fox was really strong. It allowed raiders to kind of trivialize certain mechanics by allowing all of the casters and healers to move for that incredibly limited time duration. Sure, Amplify Magic was good too. It's always nice to have extra healing, but the ability to give everyone in the raid movement while casting was kind of broken. And since players didn't really like using the ability anyway, they just kind of removed them rather than try to rebalance them to something that wasn't game breaking. And Amplify Magic just kind of got taken down alongside Aspect of the Fox, even though it wasn't as broken. So, while technically these two abilities did exist in the game for a long time beforehand, they were essentially two brand new abilities added to the game that were just given the names of old abilities that used to exist. So they definitely count for this list and only existed in the game for 2 patches. And at number 2, we have Blood Fear, a Warlock talent that only existed in early MoP for 2 patches. This ability was in the game for a slightly shorter amount of time than Aspect of the Fox, which is why it gets a higher spot, despite them both technically being in the game for 2 patches each. You see, what this ability did was it would replace the Warlock Fear ability with a new ability called Blood Fear, which basically did the exact same thing. It would fear a target for 20 seconds. However, with 2 differences, it had a 5-second cooldown, where the original Fear had no cooldown, and it was instant cast, instead of having a cast time. And the fact that this version of Fear was instant cast was kind of broken. Of course this ability existed in Mist of Pandaria. This ability is kind of the hallmark of how crazy PvP was in that expansion, where they thought giving Warlocks an instant Fear was an okay thing to do. Here's the thing about spammable CCs with no cooldowns, they're kind of balanced around the counterplay of that cast time, and the fact that they have diminishing returns. So with a cast time, there is the opportunity to play around it by running behind a pillar, or just interrupting the ability. And even then, those abilities are super strong, and historically classes that have spammable CCs, like Warlocks and Mages, have seen tons of play in Arena and other PvP because of how strong those things are. So if you take an already strong ability like Fear, and make it even stronger by removing the only counterplay option you have to it, then what you have is one of the most broken CCs in the game's history, which is called Blood Fear. Not the most broken, mind you, that would still probably be Glyph of Death and Decay, the glyph that early Wrath Death Knights used to have, but definitely on the same scale. Basically, the ability was so strong that it was just removed from the game in the middle of the expansion that had the most amount of CC out of any expansion, and you know something is broken when it's considered too strong for Mist of Pandaria PvP. So, when they removed the ability from the game, they replaced it with an ability called Blood Horror, which would cast a debuff on yourself, which would incapacitate the next target that hit the Warlock with a melee attack for 4 seconds. So nowhere near as good as the broken Blood Fear, and Blizzard went very far in the other direction, of not allowing any classes to have instant cast CCs without long cooldowns in the future. And at number 1, we have Shadow of Death, a Death Knight talented ability from early Wrath of the Lich King, which was only in the game for a single patch. Definitely the shortest amount of time an ability was removed for being too powerful. So, what did the ability do? Well, if the Death Knight died, they came back to life as a ghoul for 45 seconds. And in Wrath of the Lich King, Death Knights used to have this ability to raise other party members as ghouls after they died, before they were just given a normal battle res, which gave them their own little ghoul action bar and allowed them to do some decent damage for a bit. It was kind of like playing a hunter's pet with its own set of abilities and cooldowns. And since Death Knights would just gain this ability passively when they died, it allowed basically any Death Knight who took this talent to stay in the fight and keep performing raid mechanics after they normally would be dead and not doing any DPS. And it also allowed Death Knights to just tank mechanics which would normally kill the raid, because they can come back as ghouls and help out anyway. It also worked in arenas for some reason, where Death Knights were already the most powerful class ever added to the game. And if you did manage to kill the overpowered early Wrath Death Knight, they came back as a ghoul for 45 seconds to finish you off anyway. So the ability was very powerful, so they actually nerfed it mid-patch to reduce the duration from 45 seconds to 25 seconds, before then just removing the ability with the first major patch in 3.1. They also nerfed a whole bunch of the other Death Knight abilities because they were very overpowered in early Wrath. But most of the abilities still stayed in the game in just nerfed versions. Shadow of Death was one of the ones that was just straight up removed rather than trying to balance out an ability that allowed them to self-res every time they died without an incredibly long cooldown like Reincarnation. So for being in the game for only one patch and being removed for being powerful, as there have been other abilities that only existed in the game for the single patch that just weren't as good, this is why Shadow of Death takes the #1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other abilities that were super powerful and removed from the game quickly that I may have missed? If so, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments, as well as ideas for future videos just like this one. And also, did you know, fun fact, only 35.7% of people who watch these videos are subscribed to the channel?